Rain hammered the empty highway when Ethan Cole, a broke single mechanic drowning in debt, stopped to help a stranded woman beside a smoking Rolls-Royce. She was Victoria Hale, a cold billionaire CEO famous for humiliating employees and trusting no man. Ethan fixed the impossible engine problem in minutes, refusing her money and disappearing before dawn. Intrigued, Victoria tracked him down to a tiny repair shop on the edge of town. But the more she learned about the quiet mechanic, the more impossible the truth became. Because Ethan wasn't poor at all. He was the vanished heir to America's most powerful automotive empire. The storm had been building since nightfall, the kind that turns a highway into a river and strips everything down to its raw, essential truth. Interstate 40 stretched ahead in total darkness. Not a gas station, not a rest stop, not a single lit window for miles in any direction. Just rain and pavement, and the occasional flash of lightning that made the whole world look like a photograph taken at the wrong moment. Victoria Hale sat behind the wheel of her Rolls-Royce Phantom, and for the first time in 11 years of running a Fortune 500 company, she had absolutely no idea what to do. The engine had simply stopped. No warning light, no splutter, no polite mechanical cough, just silence, profound and total, as if the car had decided on its own that the night was over. She had called her assistant, who had called the company's emergency technical team, who had promised to arrive within 45 minutes, a timeline that now felt like a small cruelty. For 20 minutes, she had watched cars blow past without slowing, their headlights sweeping across her like searchlights, indifferent and bright. She told herself it was because the rain was too heavy, because the shoulder was too narrow, because nobody wanted the trouble. She did not let herself believe the other possibility, that they recognized the car, recognized the kind of wealth it represented, and decided that a woman like that could handle herself. Victoria Hale always handled herself. That was the whole point of her. She was 41 years old, the youngest CEO in the history of Hale Automotive Group, a company her grandfather had started in a converted barn in Michigan, and that she had transformed, through sheer force of will and a fluency with numbers that bordered on the supernatural, into a $4 billion industrial operation with subsidiaries on 3 continents. She wore her dark hair pulled back precisely, and her suit jacket even now, even alone on a rain-wrecked highway with mascara beginning its slow descent. She did not look like a woman who needed rescuing. She looked exactly like what she was, someone who had spent 2 decades making herself impossible to need. The truck appeared in her rearview mirror, the way most important things appear in a life. Without announcement, without ceremony, moving slowly against the grain of every other vehicle on the road. It was old, the kind of old that has stopped being shabby and crossed over into something almost deliberate, a 1990-something Chevy, with one headlight slightly brighter than the other, and a rear panel that had been repaired. So many times the repair itself had become a kind of artwork. It pulled over 30 yards behind her, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the driver's door swung open, and a man stepped into the rain without an umbrella, without a raincoat, without any apparent concern about the water that immediately plastered his gray shirt flat against his chest. He walked to her window, and she pressed the button before she had consciously decided to, which was unusual for her. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, with the kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors and remembered all of it. His hands, when he gestured toward the hood, were the hands of a man who had been working with them since before he was old enough to understand what work meant. The knees, the knuckles broad, the palms cross-hatched with old scars, the fingertips stained with grease that no amount of soap had fully reached. He did not introduce himself. He simply said, in a voice that was quiet enough that she had to concentrate to hear it over the rain, "May I?" and nodded at the hood release. Victoria Hale, who had not taken a business meeting without a prepared dossier in 15 years, said yes to a stranger on a dark highway without asking a single qualifying question. She would think about that later. He was under the hood for 4 minutes. She counted. The company technical team had been briefed on this model's systems, had the same proprietary diagnostic tools that Rolls-Royce provided to certified dealers, and they had not identified the fault before she left the garage that afternoon. The man in the wet gray shirt identified it in less time than it took her assistant to respond to a text. When he straightened up from the engine bay, his expression was entirely neutral, as if what he had just done was not extraordinary but simply obvious, the way you might tell someone their shoelace was untied. A small correction, a minor service. Fuel pressure regulator, he said. Secondary circuit. Your people probably looked at the primary and stopped there. He held up something small between two fingers. Examined it briefly in the beam of a flashlight he had produced from somewhere, then reached back into the engine with the practiced economy of someone who has never needed to perform for an audience. 7 minutes after that, the Phantom's engine turned over with the low, seamless power of something that had never been sick at all. Victoria stepped out of the car into the rain. She opened her purse. She had $2,000 in cash. She always carried emergency cash, a habit from her grandfather, who had survived one bankruptcy and trusted banks the way most people trust strangers on highways. She held it out to him. He looked at it the way you look at something that doesn't quite belong to the situation, not with contempt, not with hunger, just with a mild, considered distance. "I'm fine," he said. He turned back toward his truck. She called after him that she wanted to pay him properly, that this wasn't charity, that she was simply being fair, and he stopped walking but did not turn around immediately. When he did, his expression was the same, measured, unhurried. A man who lived entirely outside the economy of other people's expectations. "Honestly," he said, "the car's fine, but whoever's driving it has been running at about 15 miles per hour over what's safe for the conditions. Fast enough to get somewhere. Not quite fast enough to know why." He got back in his truck. She stood in the rain for a long moment after his taillights disappeared, the cash still in her hand, the engine idling perfectly behind her, and she felt something she had not felt in years, the specific, disorienting sensation of having been seen by someone who was not looking for anything in return. She did not sleep that night. Her penthouse on the 38th floor of a building she partially owned looked out over the city with the kind of view that real estate agents called priceless, and that Victoria had stopped noticing sometime around year 3, living in it. She stood at the glass with a cup of tea. She had made herself something she rarely did, and ran through the encounter with the systematic precision she applied to due diligence reports and board presentations. The details didn't add up in the way details were supposed to add up. The truck was old, but the tools he carried were not. She had noticed the kit when he opened it, and while she was not a mechanic, she was a person whose company manufactured engines, and what she had seen was not a weekend hobbyist's collection. The diagnostic he had performed was intuitive in a way that contradicted every expensive credential that word was usually attached to, and the manner that was the part that kept surfacing, rising back to the top, no matter how many times she tried to categorize it and set it aside. He had not been nervous. He had not been deferential. He had not treated her the way men treated her, which was in one of two modes. Either with the brittle aggression of people who found her success a personal affront, or with the slightly too eager helpfulness of people who had decided her approval was valuable currency. He had treated her, with complete and unself-conscious naturalness, like a person standing next to a car that needed fixing. She called her assistant at 6:45 in the morning. She described the truck, gave the approximate location, and asked for a name. Her assistant, a young woman named Claire who had survived 3 years in Victoria's orbit by developing an almost supernatural efficiency, called back at 7:12 with what she had found, which was not much. The truck was registered to an entity called Coal Repair, operating out of a commercial property on the eastern edge of the city, the kind of address that appeared on maps, but not in any publication that covered the city's commercial life. The business had been registered for 8 years, paid its taxes, held its licenses, and appeared in exactly 0 local profiles, business directories, or industry associations. There was no web presence. There was no public record of the owner's name. The registration listed only the business entity, which was itself registered to a private holding company that Claire had not been able to fully trace in the time available. Victoria had listened to all of this without interruption, and when Claire finished, she said only, "Keep looking," and hung up. The further investigation produced a name, Ethan Cole, and very little else. No financial profile that matched the business's apparent age. No credit history that told the story of a man who had been operating for nearly a decade. No social media presence of any kind. Not a dormant account. Not a deleted profile. Not a ghost of the digital footprint that everyone alive in the modern world left simply by existing. In Victoria's experience, there were 2 kinds of people with no digital presence. those who were too old or too isolated to have created one, and those who had worked, with considerable effort and deliberate intention, to make themselves unfindable. Ethan Cole was in his mid-30s. He was not isolated. She had seen him interact with people, seen the way they responded to him, which meant the absence was a choice, and choices of that magnitude were always attached to something worth protecting, or something worth hiding. She drove herself to the garage the following Tuesday, in a company car rather than the Phantom, wearing less of herself than usual, a simple coat, no jewelry, her hair down. She had told Claire she had a lunch across town. The garage was a single-bay operation on a street that had not yet been absorbed into the city's expansion, the kind of block that still had a hardware store, and a diner with paper menus, and a barber who had been cutting hair in the same chair for 30 years. Cole Repair had no sign above the door, just the address in faded numbers, and a hand-lettered placard in the window that said OPN in black marker. She sat in the car for a moment before getting out, watching through the chain-link fence that enclosed the small lot. He was working on a sedan that had clearly lived a hard life, a mid-90s Civic with a crumpled quarter panel and tires that had been rotated so many times they had forgotten their original position. The car's owner was visible too. A woman in her 60s, in a postal service uniform, standing a few feet back and watching Ethan work with the expression of someone who had been told not to worry about the cost and had decided, against all their prior experience with mechanics, to believe it. Victoria went inside. The waiting area was 3 chairs and a coffee machine that appeared to be from the first Bush administration and was, inexplicably, making perfectly good coffee. She poured herself a cup without asking, because there was no one to ask, and sat down. Through the interior window, she could see the garage floor, could watch Ethan move around the Civic with that same unhurried, wholly sufficient competence she had noticed on the highway. He was explaining something to the woman. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the dynamic, the way the woman's shoulders loosened, the way she nodded with genuine comprehension, rather than the polite blankness that most people deploy when a mechanic explains a repair. He was charging her, Victoria would learn later, less than half what any shop in the city would have taken for the same work. Not because he was careless about money, because he had done the math a different way. When the Civic drove away and he finally walked into the waiting area and saw her, his reaction was neither surprise nor pleasure, nor the particular guardedness that famous faces often produce in people. He looked at her, set down the wrench he was carrying, and said, "The fuel pressure regulator holding up?" Victoria said it was. She put the folder she had brought on the counter between them, a folder containing the specifications for Hale Automotive Group's newest platform, the one her engineering division had spent 16 months developing, and that was scheduled to enter production in 4 months. She had been awake for the better part of 3 nights, since her chief engineer had shown her the discrepancy in the stress projections, a subtle, cascading flaw in the secondary thermal management system that none of her team had conclusively resolved. She opened the folder and turned it toward him without preamble, without the paragraph of contextualizing information she would normally provide, because she had the sense that preamble was a language he did not particularly need. He looked at the diagrams. He looked for maybe 90 seconds, which she had expected to feel insultingly brief, but which instead felt like watching someone read very fast in a second language they had become more fluent in than their first. Then he straightened up, crossed his arms, and said, "If you keep this thermal routing configuration, the secondary actuator bearings are going to fail under sustained high load cycles. Based on your projected production volume and average use patterns," he paused, recalculating something she couldn't see. "You're looking at widespread failures starting around month 6, maybe month 7 if you get lucky with regional climate conditions." Victoria said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "My chief engineer believes the probability of failure in that scenario is less than 12%. Ethan nodded slowly, as if 12% were a number she had invented to make herself feel better, which, she was beginning to understand, it was. Her team ran the validation scenarios over the following 72 hours, feeding the thermal routing parameters through the simulation suite with the specific variables Ethan had identified. The failure probability came back at 41%. At certain temperature thresholds, it climbed above 60. The projected liability, in the most conservative model her legal team produced, exceeded $1.8 billion. The optimistic model was not something she looked at twice. Victoria sat in her office at 11 o'clock at night, looking at those numbers and understanding with complete clarity that the man in the garage on the east side of the city had just saved her company, in a single glance at a technical schematic, from a catastrophe that her entire credentialed engineering apparatus had been building toward for 16 months. She called Claire. She said she needed a meeting with Ethan Cole. Claire, who had learned to read tone better than most people read text, said she would arrange it immediately. The meeting did not go the way Victoria had planned meetings for 2 decades. She offered him a consulting contract, senior technical advisor. Compensation structured to reflect the scale of what he had already prevented. She named a number that would have produced a grateful silence in almost anyone she had ever hired. He listened to all of it. Standing, rather than sitting, one shoulder against the doorframe of her corner office, with its view of the whole city laid out below, like a very expensive map. And when she finished, he said, without any apparent difficulty, "No." She asked him why. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone searching for an answer, but of someone deciding how much of the answer to give. He said that he had spent the better part of 15 years learning to live at a sufficient distance from the world that she occupied, and that the distance was not accidental, and not a failure of ambition, but a considered conclusion. He said that in his experience, companies of her scale did not actually want the truth. They wanted a version of the truth that was compatible with the decisions they had already made. Victoria said, with the measured precision of someone who has been told no in board meetings and at acquisition tables and by regulators in 3 countries, "I don't need someone who'll make me feel better. I need someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong." He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without flinching, which was not something many people did. He said yes. His conditions were stated simply and without negotiation. No announcement of his involvement, no title, no requirement to attend the social events that punctuated the life of a company like hers, no suit unless there was a genuine structural reason for it. She agreed to all of it. What she did not say, as he left her office and took the elevator down to the parking garage, where his truck sat between 2 European sedans, like a deliberate provocation, was that something in the exchange had shifted her internal register in a way she didn't have immediate language for. Victoria Hale had interviewed 600 people in her career. She had hired 300 of them. She had never, in any of those conversations, felt the specific sensation of being the less interesting person in the room. The first morning he came in, someone laughed. It was brief, a junior engineer catching a colleague's eye across the open floor, but Victoria heard it from her office, and she remembered it, filed it away with the precision she applied to everything. Ethan arrived without ceremony in work pants and a faded blue Henley, carrying a coffee from the diner down the street, and he walked through the engineering department the way he had walked into her car on the highway, with the complete absence of performance. He did not try to prove anything. He did not need to, which was the quality that certain men found most intolerable about him. The technical director, a man named Paul Archer, who had 3 advanced degrees and had been at Hale for 9 years, briefed him on the current status of the thermal management crisis with the barely suppressed condescension of someone confident in his own irreplaceability. Ethan listened without interrupting. Then he asked to see the original supplier specifications for the secondary actuator, the ones from before the in-house team had modified them to reduce per unit cost by $11. The room got quieter. Paul said those weren't relevant to the current design iteration. Ethan said, with perfect pleasantness, that he understood, and asked again if he could see them. They were pulled up. He found the divergence point in roughly 4 minutes, the specific modification that had seemed like a rounding error, and was instead the origin of the entire cascading failure chain, and he explained it in language so clear, so stripped of jargon and credential signaling, that the newest member of the engineering team, a 24-year-old who had been afraid to speak in departmental meetings, understood it immediately and said so out loud. Marcus Bellows, the CFO, did not laugh. Marcus was 53 and had been managing the financial architecture of Hale Automotive since before Victoria had taken over, and his relationship to power was the relationship of a man who had tended it carefully his entire career, watering it in small ways, protecting it from weather, never letting it out of his immediate sight. He watched Ethan from across the open floor and understood, with the instinct of someone who has spent decades in close proximity to genuine competence, that what had just walked through the door was a problem. Not because Ethan was incompetent, the opposite. Marcus understood in the first 40 minutes of watching the man work that incompetence was not the issue at all. The issue was that Ethan Cole was better than everyone in the building at the thing the building existed to do, and that he had not arrived with any of the normal debts that competence usually carries: no loyalty, no ambition, no need for Marcus to understand, and therefore shape. A person without ambition in a building full of it was like a variable in an equation that refused to behave. Marcus began making inquiries. Quietly, carefully. The way he did everything. The photograph was found in the archives of an automotive industry publication, a feature piece from 22 years prior on the occasion of Cole Motors' 25th anniversary. It showed the company's founder, Walter Cole, standing in front of the Cole Motors headquarters in Detroit, with his arm around a boy who could not have been more than 12 years old. The boy was grinning with the complete, unself-conscious joy of someone who has not yet learned to manage his expressions for cameras. He had dark hair and a jaw that would sharpen with age and eyes that looked at the camera with the same direct, unhurried regard that Marcus had been watching all morning from across the floor. Marcus looked at the photograph for a long time. Then, he made a different kind of inquiry, the kind that costs significantly more than a subscription to an industry archive. Victoria confronted Ethan on a Thursday evening after the building had cleared out, the two of them alone in the engineering lab, with the thermal models still running on the monitors behind them and the city going dark outside the windows. She had the photograph. She put it on the table between them, the way he had put the wrench down that first day in the garage without drama, simply as an object that needed to be present. He looked at it. Something moved across his face that she had not seen before. Not the neutral competence he wore like working clothes, but something older and less managed. A reflex of pain so rapid and well-practiced that she almost missed it. He said her name, which was the first time he had used it, and then he stopped. She asked him if it was true. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and walked out. She sat with that for 3 days before she saw the whole shape of it, not through what Marcus eventually told her, not through the additional investigation her own team conducted, but through the accumulation of small things that had been in front of her since the first night on the highway, and that she had been reading in the wrong language. The way he priced his work for the woman in the postal uniform. The way he knew the secondary actuator specifications without looking them up. The fact that Cole Repair was named Cole Repair, sitting there in plain sight the way the most important things always are, waiting for someone to stop moving fast enough to see it. Walter Cole had died in 2011, 18 months after a series of board decisions that diverted capital from Cole Motors' core research division into a leveraged acquisition strategy that 3 members of the board, including, she would later confirm, a younger and more junior Marcus Bellows, then consulting for the acquiring consortium, had championed with the specific enthusiasm of people who expected to benefit from the chaos. The acquisition had failed. Cole Motors had been absorbed in a restructuring. The heir, who had been 19 years old and studying mechanical engineering at Michigan State, had simply not appeared when the lawyers came looking. The legal resolution had taken 4 years, had produced a settlement that included a significant stock position in the successor entities, and had concluded with a man who had chosen to become invisible. The understanding of it, the full weight of what he had built around himself, and why arrived for Victoria, not as revelation, but as recognition, the sensation of finally having the right word for something she had been sensing since a dark highway in the rain. She did not go to the garage to confront him. She went because she needed to understand, which was different, and because she had been running from her own version of the same thing long enough to know what it looked like from the outside. She was the 4th Victoria Hale in a direct line, each one defined by the accumulation of what the previous had built, and she had spent her adult life understanding that the most dangerous thing you could do in her position was need anything that could be used against you. She had structured her entire existence around that understanding. She sat across from him at the small folding table in the back of the garage, where he apparently ate lunch and sometimes dinner. And she told him this, plainly, without the diplomatic wrapping she usually applied to anything personal. He listened. He was very still. She said she didn't need him to explain himself, and she didn't need the truth to be different from what it was. She needed him to know that she understood the choice, even if she didn't understand the full cost of it yet. He talked for a long time. She had not heard him talk that much in all the weeks she had known him, had not realized that underneath the economy of his communication, there was a man who had thought about everything very carefully and carried all of it quietly and alone. He told her about his father, about Walter Cole, who had been a genuinely great man in the old sense, someone who had believed that building something exceptional was its own justification, who had treated the people who worked in his factories with the kind of specific dignity that is rarer in industry than any patent. He told her about the board, about watching from a distance. At 19, as the people his father had trusted systematically dismantled what Walter had spent his life constructing. He told her that he had decided, standing at his father's funeral with a stock portfolio he hadn't asked for and a grief he hadn't been prepared for, that the thing wealth did most reliably was reveal the worst version of the people who held it, that it acted on character, the way heat acts on certain materials, not changing what's there but making it visible, and often making it worse. He had walked away. He had become, with deliberate commitment, the person he had always been when he was happiest, which was someone with his hands on an engine and nothing to prove. Victoria listened to all of it. She did not offer the reassurance or the counter-argument that he might have expected, because neither felt true enough to say. What she said, after a long silence that he didn't try to fill, was that she had spent 11 years building a company that was worth significantly more than her grandfather's barn and significantly less than her grandfather's conviction, and that she had understood this for years and continued anyway because she hadn't known what else to do with herself. It was the most honest thing she had said to another person in a very long time, and saying it felt like setting down something heavy in a way that she had not anticipated, and that made her eyes sting briefly before she looked at the wall until they stopped. He did not say anything immediately. He handed her a cup of coffee from the ancient machine in the front room, and they sat together in the particular quiet of two people who have told each other the truth and are waiting to see what it does. The weeks that followed had a texture different from anything in Victoria's recent life. She had not understood, before this, how many of her days were made of performance, not dishonesty, but the sustained, effortful projection of a self that was adequate to every room she entered. With Ethan, there was no room large enough to require it. They worked in the engineering lab until late some evenings, him in his work clothes, her in the blazer she eventually stopped wearing, both of them leaning over the same technical drawings in the particular collaborative silence of people who are thinking in the same direction. He came to a team dinner once, reluctant and quiet at the edge of it, and she watched him listen to the junior engineers talk about their work with the specific attention of someone for whom other people's competence was genuinely interesting. He showed her, one Saturday morning, how to replace a brake caliper, patient with her fumbling in a way that contained no condescension, simply the steady support of someone who has learned that teaching is just another kind of respect. She showed him, one evening over takeout in her office, the quarterly report for a subsidiary he had identified as structurally undervalued, and he read it with the same total absorption that he brought to engine schematics, which she found unexpectedly moving the recognition that his intelligence had no preferred subject, that it was simply attention applied with full weight. She was falling in love with him, and she knew it with the same lucid clarity with which she understood balance sheets and load-bearing projections. She did not tell him, not because she was afraid, precisely, but because she understood that Ethan Cole had built his distance from the world at great personal cost, and that anything she said that required him to move toward her, toward the world she occupied, was a demand she hadn't earned the right to make. She watched him. She waited. She hoped, in the way that competent and self-sufficient people allow themselves to hope when they have run out of reasons not to. Marcus moved in the third month. The story appeared in 2 financial publications simultaneously. The structure of it suggested coordination. The timing of it confirmed intent. It characterized Ethan as an opportunist, a man who had manufactured an opportunity to insert himself into Victoria Hale's company and personal life, who was deploying a manufactured identity of blue-collar humility to access a relationship that would ultimately benefit a concealed financial position. The articles were specific enough to be credible and vague enough to be undeniable. The particular combination that the best financial journalists learn to construct when they are being used without being used enough to mind. Victoria read them in the car on the way to the office and felt something she had not felt in years, not anger, which she understood, but the specific grief of watching something being deliberately broken. She called Ethan. He didn't answer. She went to the garage. It was locked. A note in the window, handwritten on a paper bag, said, "Closed for personal reasons," in the same plain lettering as the open sign. She stood outside it in the cold morning air and understood, with the clarity that comes from knowing someone well enough to follow their logic to its conclusion, that he had seen the articles and calculated the cost of his presence to her reputation and made the decision that she was not aware she had needed him not to make. He had removed himself. He had treated himself with the same precise economy he applied to everything, as a liability to be managed. She drove back to the office. She went into the board meeting that had been on the calendar for 3 weeks, a routine quarterly review, and sat down at the table across from Marcus Bellows, and she looked at him for a long moment before any of the agenda was called. He looked back at her. In his expression was the composed satisfaction of a man who had made his move and was now waiting to see the board confirm it. She turned to the board. She had spent the previous 2 weeks, she told them, conducting a confidential technical review of a critical production error that would, if uncorrected, have cost this company in excess of $1.8 billion in liability, recall costs, and reputational damage. The review had been conducted with the assistance of an outside consultant whose identity she was prepared to disclose in full. She opened the file in front of her and began. An hour and 20 minutes later, the board had seen the technical analysis, the original supplier specifications, the before and after failure probability models, the consultant's written assessment, and 3 independent validations from external engineering firms that she had commissioned after Ethan's initial finding. She paused. Then she said that she was also prepared to share preliminary findings from a financial investigation she had initiated into the circumstances surrounding the 2008 acquisition of Cole Motors assets, which appeared to involve a member of the board's current advisory structure. The room was very quiet. Marcus Bellows did not move. Victoria said she was happy to conduct that discussion at the full board's convenience, or, alternatively, in a smaller setting with legal counsel present. She left the choice to the room. Marcus asked to speak with her privately. She said she was quite comfortable discussing it here. What followed over the next 3 weeks was not a dramatic confrontation in the cinematic sense. It was the unglamorous, procedural, completely ruthless work of dismantling a 20-year structure of concealed interest. The investigation was forensic, the legal process was methodical, and Marcus was ultimately neither villain enough for a story nor innocent enough for an argument. The financial irregularities were documented. The connections between the 2008 acquisition consortium and the current financial positions of several advisory relationships were traced. A criminal referral was made in the matter of documents that had been altered in the year of Walter Cole's accident, a fact that surfaced late in the investigation, and that nobody in the room spoke about in anything louder than a controlled, professional tone. The media coverage was extensive and inaccurate, in the way that media coverage of corporate events always is, emphasizing the dramatic over the structural and missing, almost entirely, the actual story. Ethan reappeared not because he had decided to, but because the investigation required his testimony regarding the original Cole Motors board documentation, and the attorney handling the matter had tracked him to a property in rural Michigan where he had been for 11 days. He came back in a truck that was not the Chevy. That one, it turned out, he had left for a client who needed a vehicle and couldn't afford one but a rental that had the particular anonymity of a vehicle chosen by someone who had no preferences about vehicles, which given everything was almost funny. He walked into the law offices in a clean shirt, with the same hands and the same expression, and sat across from a conference table of attorneys who kept looking at him with a specific, reflexive deference that he was clearly not interested in receiving. Victoria watched from across the table and understood something she had been circling for months. The way power had simply failed to attach itself to him, not because he was weak, she had never in her life met anyone less weak, but because he had never given it the surface to grip. He came to find her afterward. Not to the office, to the roof of the office building, where there was a garden she had installed in her first year and visited perhaps 4 times since. She was there because Claire had told him where she was, a small act of loyalty that she would thank her for later. He stood at the edge of the garden looking out over the city, and she stood next to him, and for a while neither of them said anything, which had always been one of the things that worked between them. He said he had seen what she had done, not just the investigation, but the technical documentation, the way she had laid out the entire case in the board meeting, without a single moment of theater. He said it was the most technically precise piece of advocacy he had ever seen in a corporate context. It was possibly the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her. She told him that. He laughed a real laugh, not the careful smile she had seen him use when he was being polite, and it was the first time she had heard it, and she filed it away with the precision she applied to everything important. He said her name again. She turned to face him. He took her hand with the hand that still had grease under the thumbnail, because there is no amount of money that fully solves that problem, and he held it in the specific way of someone who has decided that the distance is no longer worth what it costs. She told him, that evening, about the garage. She had found out, through Claire's investigation in the early weeks, that the property on which Cole Repair sat was owned by a development company that had been planning to demolish the block for a mixed-use commercial project. She had acquired the development company's outstanding debt 3 months prior, in a transaction structured through a subsidiary and routed through enough layers of holding companies that it would take a determined analyst weeks to find her name in it. She had then renegotiated the debt terms in a way that made the demolition financially unviable, which had effectively frozen the project and left the garage and the block around it intact. She told him this in a tone that was not proud. Exactly more like someone presenting an accurate accounting, which is how she handled most things. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You didn't tell me." She said she hadn't needed to. He said, "No. I mean, you didn't use it. You didn't tell me to keep me here." She said she didn't want to keep him anywhere. She wanted him to choose. He turned her hand over in his and looked at her hand in his, the difference in their hands, the particular fact of it, and said that he had been choosing for a while. She said she knew. He said he knew she knew. They stayed on the roof until the city finished going dark, and the lights came up below them like a second, electric version of itself. 1 year is not a long time in a life, but it is enough time to see which changes hold. The engineering division at Hale Automotive had been restructured after the Marcus investigation quietly, without the wide press coverage that had characterized the scandal's beginning, and the changes were the unglamorous kind that actually work. Clearer accountability chains. A technical review process that rewarded identifying problems early rather than suppressing them. A supplier ethics audit that found 6 additional relationships worth reconsidering. The production platform launched 4 months late, without the thermal management flaw, and the delayed launch cost the company $40 million in market share, that it recovered entirely within 2 quarters because the platform performed the way it was supposed to perform, reliably, and across conditions, the way that things built right always do. The workers on the production floor, who had never met Ethan Cole and did not know his name, benefited from a revised compensation structure and a safety incident reporting system that had been recommended by someone whose fingerprints were not on any of the official documents. Cole Repair reopened with a different sign hand-lettered still, in the same black marker. But reading. Now, Cole Repair and Training, which was the visible part of a more significant change. The Cole Mechanical Institute occupied the 2nd floor of the building next door, a space that had been a storage unit for a plumbing supply company and that now contained 12 stations, 12 sets of professional-grade tools, and a curriculum that Ethan had written himself, in the evenings, in longhand, in a notebook that he had not told anyone about. The program trained 48 students in its first cohort, all of them from the East Side and the surrounding neighborhoods, all of them on full scholarship from a foundation that was funded by a portion of the stock settlement from the original Cole Motors resolution, a position worth, after 15 years of market performance, a figure that required several commas. The foundation structure was such that Ethan was not listed as the primary donor. He was listed as the director of instruction. The ceremony at the end of the first cohort's training was held in the garage lot on a Saturday morning in October, and the local press covered it with the warm, slightly generic enthusiasm of local press covering a good news story. A photographer from the city's largest daily had been told that the foundation's primary backer might attend, and the financial desk had run a piece earlier in the week about the Cole Motors settlement that included the words "vanished heir" in its headline, which the financial desk was pleased with, and Ethan had not commented on. He arrived at the ceremony in the clothes he wore every day, and the photographer found him standing with 3 of the new graduates near one of the training stations, explaining something about a differential housing with the total absorption of a man who is doing exactly and only what he wants to be doing. The photographer took the picture. The financial desk's story got picked up nationally. By Monday morning, the phrase vanished heir was everywhere. Attached to a man in work clothes with grease on his hands, standing in a garage on the east side of the city, and the story had the particular momentum of stories that are true in ways that larger, more expensive narratives rarely manage to be. Victoria found him that evening in the garage, where he was finishing the last of the day's actual repair work, a transmission job on a 12-year-old pickup that belonged to one of the new graduate's fathers. She leaned in the doorway and watched him work for a while. The way she had watched him that first day through the chain-link fence, before she had known anything about him except that he moved like someone who had never needed an audience. He knew she was there. He finished what he was doing, set the wrench down in the specific, considered way that she had come to understand was not absent-mindedness, but its opposite, everything in its place, because everything mattered and turned around. He had grease on his forearm and a smear of something darker on his jaw that she was fairly certain he didn't know about. She told him he was all over the news. He said he knew. She asked him how he felt about it. He thought about this for a moment, which was how he handled questions that deserved actual answers. He said he felt about the same as always. She said she didn't believe him. He said, a little less hidden, maybe. She said that was probably fine. He said he was starting to think so. She stepped out of the doorway and into the garage, and he met her halfway, which was not a metaphor because Ethan Cole did not live in metaphors. It was simply the two of them in the lit space of a garage that smelled like oil and metal and the particular clean cold of an October night coming through the open bay door, and she put her hand on his jaw, where the grease smear was, and he looked at her with the full, unhurried attention that was simply how he looked at everything he had decided to care about. She said, "You know you're a billionaire, right?" He said, "Technically," she said. "And you're choosing gesturing at the garage, the tools, the transmission that was still half assembled on the lift behind him." He said, "I spent 15 years choosing this." A pause. "I think I was right." She said she thought so too. He said, "Though I could be persuaded on the vest." She laughed. He smiled, the real one. The one she had been collecting since the first time she heard it, and he reached over and turned the bay light down by half. And the city went on outside in all its expensive, indifferent motion, and inside the garage on the east side, two people who had each spent a long time running from different versions of the same thing, stood in the warm, grease-scented dark, and were, for once, exactly where they meant to be. Some people spend their whole lives looking for the place that fits the one where they don't have to reshape themselves to fill it, where the silence is comfortable and the effort is the good kind, the kind that builds something rather than sustaining an image. Victoria Hale had run a $4 billion company and never quite found it. Ethan Cole had walked away from everything and built it with his own hands in a garage no one had heard of. The remarkable thing, the thing that neither of them said out loud, because some truths are more durable when they're left to exist without language, was that they had found it in the same place, not despite who they were, but because of it, a woman who had learned to see through things, and a man who had never needed to pretend. In the end, that was the only repair that had ever really mattered.